Welcome to the Mental Health Raw and Open podcast with your host, Jody Betty.
Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to the Mental Health and Raw and Open podcast. My name is Jody, and I'm your host. And we have a special guest today. Her name is Ernestine Whitman, and she is an author and a retired flutist. Ernestine, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Jody. And as I was telling Jody, my voice is weak due to asthma inhalers. So if at any point you can't hear me, just yell at me and I'll try to be louder. But you can hear me now.
Okay, it's good. So far, we have a fantastic connection, so it's good.
Okay. Okay. Well, first, I really wanted to thank you for your blog postings about depression. It's still something that unfortunately has a stigma, and I find it very hard to, and I'd even use the word admit, which kind of is irritating that I still think of it that way. But it is difficult to talk about, and I feel like the only people who understand are those who have been there, or else an incredibly fantastic therapist, which I was not fortunate to have. So thank you. I think I have, I don't think, I know this, that I've attempted suicide twice. And I think if I had been able to read one of your blog posts that is, as this says, open and raw, it would have pulled me back. I think it would have kept me from taking that next step that endangers your life because you just need to talk to someone who gets it. And that can be hard. Okay.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely. And thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. I appreciate you reading my blogs.
well, I think it's comforting when you've been that low, even though it's hard to read. It just makes you feel less alone. Plus, if you know that person is still living, and I know you are, then, you say, okay, they made it. All right, I'll tell you a little about my background. I've been retired for 15 years. Most of my career, I was the flute professor at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, where I still live and where it is a beautiful, not hot day. Um, my job there included a lot of performing, and I always loved performing, especially with an orchestra because I have a deep passion for orchestral music. My first job was at age 20. I won an audition to be second flute in the Atlanta Symphony. And
Wow.
that it was a really good job. It's a very good orchestra. I was the youngest and one of the very few women in the orchestra. The only problem was that I landed beside my beloved mentor and things got difficult. So, giving that sketchy a background, what I thought I'd start with is reading a little bit from the book that describes my first lesson with. His name was Warren Little. And it's fine to talk about him. He's been deceased for quite some time. So
Okay, cool.
all you need to know is that my friend Anne got me to join the band and play the flute. And in junior high, we had serious crushes on our band director who was cool and cute. And it was really fun to have a junior high. So fast forward to I entered in a 5-year high school. So I was a sub freshman, and here we go with an excerpt. After 2 years in Mr. Barron's band, my friends and I switched schools and band directors. We returned to the old K 12 school, which was now a large 5-year high school. I was a lowly sub freshman, and instead of sitting confidently At the head of a row of 8 flutists, I sat towards the end of a semicircle of 18 girls, girls who dressed well, wore makeup, and actually needed bras. I felt like this skinny little nobody. Anne and I mourned the loss of Mr. Barron. We had traded our cute idol for a strange man named Mr. Little. Oddly, Mr. Little was big, tall and overweight with a large round face, straight black hair swept back from his high forehead. His rimless glasses and ill-fitting brown suit did nothing to enhance his awkward appearance. In striking contrast to Mr. Barron, Mr. Little seemed ill at ease with the band. His face registered two expressions: irritated and bored. Our junior high crushes certainly didn't transfer to this weird man. While Anne and I compared our uncool band director with Mr. Barron, Mother took steps to follow Mr. Barron's advice. He had said my flute talent would develop more quickly if I had private lessons, and he recommended the principal flutist in the Atlanta Symphony, reputed to be the best flutist not only in Atlanta but in the entire South. Unfortunately, the one open time slot was 8 a.m. on Saturday. My first lesson occurred in early fall when most Atlantans feel a sense of renewed energy after summer's oppressive heat and humidity. But I was a teenager. I didn't want to be up at that hour on Saturday in any weather. I sulked all the way to the teacher's house, sighing noisily in protest. As I opened the car door, Mother turned to me. "You should probably know this man's name. It's Mr. Little." "Mother, for Pete's sake," I said, almost yelling, "that's the weird band director. Why didn't you tell me? I don't want to take lessons with him. Why can't I study with Mr. Barron?" "Well, for one thing, he's not a flutist. You know that. But he could still teach me a lot. Mr. Barron is the one who recommended Mr. Little. So go on, just take this one lesson and then we can talk about it. It's almost 8, so there you go." As I climbed the steps to the front door of Mr. Little's house, I thought how embarrassing it would be if my friends found out I was studying with the uncool band director. Reluctantly, I rang the doorbell. When he appeared, framed in the doorway, Mr. Little seemed twice as tall and far more imposing than he had seemed in the band room. I felt a little nervous. "You must be Ernestine," he said, somewhat awkwardly. Yes was all I could think of to say. Even though I didn't like him, I kind of resented the fact that I'd been in his band for 2 weeks, yet he had no idea which flutist I was in that long row of flutes. Another strike against him. As he stepped aside to let me in, I considered backing down the steps. Mr. Little led me to the back of his small house where a den had been converted into a music room. 2 chairs sat side by side with a music stand in front of one of them. Somehow the room felt inviting, maybe because it was right off the kitchen. It was 8 a.m. I was in a strange man's house, but at least I recognized the smell of bacon. In the crowded room, a small faded couch sat against a wall perpendicular to the chairs. The wall opposite the couch contained bookshelves crammed with untidy stacks of music. "Did you bring something to play?" he asked after we sat down. "Yes," I said, putting my book of solos on the music stand. I turned to a fast movement of a Handel sonata, a piece I knew well. "Okay, go ahead, take whatever tempo you like," Mr. Little said. "Very good," he said after I finished. I turned to face him and was astonished to see a big smile on his face, a genuine smile that made his eyes crinkle up. The awkward band director had disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated warmth and reassurance. Despite my previous opinion of him, I just wanted to crawl inside the warmth of that remarkable smile. So, how about some sight reading? He asked, opening a volume of selected flute duets. I really wanted to impress him with my sight reading ability, but it was hard to focus on the music because I'd never sat beside such a lovely flute sound. Having heard only fellow band members, I had no idea a flute tone could be beautiful. Mr. Little's sound had none of the fuzzy white noise that plagues most band flutists, and it was fuller, even when he was playing softly, sort of like it was composed of lots of colors. When we stopped, I almost blurted out, "Wow, you're a good sight reader," he said. "There are a couple of books of music I'd like you to purchase. Did you bring a notebook?" "Oh, I'm sorry, it didn't. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I'll skip a little bit of that." um, "Don't worry," Mr. Little said when he sensed my disappointment that there was no book of solos on the list. "After another lesson or two, we'll decide which solos you'll be studying. For next week, I'd like you to prepare Flight of the Bumblebee from the book you have. It's short but very challenging. Don't go too fast at first, just try to make it clear and even." He got up from his chair as I finished putting my flute in its case. "I'm glad you decided to take lessons, Ernestine. I'll see you next week, and I'm sorry it has to be so early." I almost skipped to the car. I wanted to shout, "Hey, I just played duets with the principal flutist of the Atlanta Symphony." "Well, how did it go?" Mother asked. "Much better than I thought," I admitted. At the beginning of each lesson, Mr. Little greeted me warmly and seemed eager to hear me play. I continued to be captivated by his smile, one that enveloped you and conveyed not just friendliness, but delight and encouragement. And I'll stop there, but I think you get a sense of how this 13-year-old really uh, connected with Mr. Little, even at the first flute lesson at age 13.
Absolute, absolutely. Can you, before you carry on, can you tell us the name of your book?
Oh, sure. Yes, it is called Counter Melodies. And the subtitle, which don't let it turn you off, a memoir in sonata form. And it doesn't come out till September 24th, but it will be, you can order it from Amazon or Barnes and Noble, even Target for some weird reason is going
Wow,
to have it available.
that's
Um,
great. Congratulations.
well, thank you. I didn't start writing till I was 70. So if there are any older listeners out there, life isn't over when you retire. You can start new things.
Yeah, that's an inspiration for me. I'm not quite 70, but I do
Right.
have a book that I want I want to get written, um, in the next year or two. So, knowing that you've done that gives me inspiration. So thank you.
Well, from what I've read, you've got a lot to write about.
Yes, I certainly do. Yes.
Um, so I thought I'd talk a little bit more. Well, let me present this. Three things that happened to me in my 20s um, that were the cause or the fallout from the suicide attempts: rape, betrayal by a mentor, and having a manipulative, unscrupulous, to say the least, therapist. And if you had to pick what you think would be the most traumatic, you'd probably pick rape, but it's not, it wasn't true for me. And I think part of it is the closeness of the relationship when you see someone one on one for an hour. For me, it was 5 years, eighth through 12th grade. And especially when that person gives you the encouragement and even is proud of your achievements, things that I never got from my parents. So he definitely became a surrogate father.
Mm-hmm.
So the first year I was in the symphony sitting beside him, it was fine. But at the beginning of the second year, we got a very demanding new conductor. He auditioned everyone one by one and fired about a third of the orchestra. So all of us were under increased pressure. But of course, me, I was 21 and I admired and adored my teacher who was 20 years older and had been in the orchestra for 20 years. So I couldn't imagine that he'd be under any pressure. But looking back, I can see that there was a bit of a perfect storm here in that he was facing stressors, and that's part of why he turned against me. What he would do is mutter during rehearsals, he would mutter insults under his breath so nobody else could hear. But he'd say things like, "Is that your good flute?" Or "Don't you ever practice?" And the one that got to me the most was, "You don't belong in a professional orchestra." He would also do things to sabotage my playing. If there was an exposed flute duet in a piece, he would on purpose sound badly. He would play poorly so that we would sound bad. And then when it was over, he'd scowl at me, and I was the newbie young one. So, of course, I got blamed for it. But it was very hard for me to be objective and not believe every word he said. So I wanted to keep the job.
Mm-hmm.
I loved playing in the orchestra, but I became more and more depressed and not confident at all in my playing. So eventually I thought I better talk to a therapist, and most of them were pretty pricey. So I ended up with a man who was training to be an analyst. He was pretty inexpensive. I actually saw him 4 times a week, but he training,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. Um, I was lucky that the Atlanta Symphony rehearsal schedule allowed me to see him, except on Wednesday when we had double rehearsals. So, unlike a 9 to 5 job, I did have, pretty flexible schedule. But he wanted to focus on family of origin issues. And God knows there were plenty of those, and that they were at the root of why I was finding it so difficult to deal with this man's really betrayal. I got more and more depressed, and the more I tried to talk about what was happening in the orchestra, the more he would insist, "Well, but let's go back to the cause of all this." So I am sure that some of your listeners are thinking, "Ugh, a classical musician. I am not interested in that book or that writer." But I wanted to read a little bit about the concert that was the night of my first suicide attempt. And I think the specifics are very different, but you will probably recognize some universal feelings for those of us who have thought of suicide.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
And Jody, all my traumas occur in the winter. I so can relate to seasonal affective disorder. And,
All right, yeah.
but
I never look forward to the winter, let me tell you.
well, and in Canada, I mean, it's bad enough in Wisconsin. Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we go. As winter approached, my depression deepened. I became more and more isolated, avoiding even the briefest interactions with people. My attachment to Dr. Norton weakened when he failed to understand the effects of Warren's behavior. Repeated attempts to talk to my roommates simply underscored how little we had in common. And day after day, my former mentor disparaged me. My world shrank until only one thing seemed real: Warren's contempt for me. I was a failure as a flutist. I was a failure, period. One Friday night in mid December, I struggled to focus on playing my part during a performance of Robert Shaw's lovely Christmas choral program. Most members of the orchestra had been delighted to replace the traditional Nutcracker with Shaw's inspired program of Christmas music that featured his extraordinary choir. But I had barely made it through last night's performance without breaking down, and I still had to play the rest of tonight's. Christmas. Loving families, giving presents to each other, sharing holiday meals. I hadn't been part of a happy family for a very long time, and the increased intensity of Warren's attacks made this Christmas especially hard. Music had always been my solace, a way to both express and escape from emotional turmoil. Far from comforting, music was now the source of the pain. Tonight, the pure, sweet voice of the boy soprano singing Mozart's Laudate Dominum chipped away at my composure. Then the beautiful sound of the choir engulfed me during the haunting selection of Berlioz' The Shepherd's Farewell to the Holy Family. Family, how I hated that word. It meant belonging. Had I ever felt like I belonged? And then I did remember, yes, childhood Christmases, a sense of enchantment, decorating the tree, watching the children's opera Amal and the Night Visitors on our tiny black and white TV as a family. When my sister and I were little, each year, Mother put aside the marital and financial strife that she struggled with to create magical Christmases. But that was many, many years ago. The walls of the hall closed in, squeezing me out. I couldn't stand seeing the happiness of others. I was the loner surrounded by groups, couples and families in the audience, singers together in the choir, friends in the orchestra, but not my friends. Warren had made it clear I didn't belong there. I was a fraud, a pretender. If not in the orchestra, where did I belong? Each note of the shepherd's farewell mocked me. The lush sound of the strings, playing a slow, tender melody, reminded me of my first orchestra rehearsal 6 years ago when I had fallen in love with the orchestra. I had wanted nothing more than to be part of that gorgeous sound. But tonight, that same beauty hurt. I wanted to run across the stage screaming that I didn't belong, that an imposter was playing the second flute part. I forced myself to play the rest of the program. As soon as the last note ended, I slammed the flute into its case, rushed off the stage, and drove recklessly to my apartment, running a red light at 14th Street and edging the speedometer to 100. Tempting fate, desperate to do something, anything to avoid the incessant hours of Warren's ridicule. My father had been right all along. It was ludicrous to think I could be a successful musician. I could no longer maintain the facade, and I had no desire to do anything else. I ran into the apartment, not bothering to hang my coat in the front closet. I rushed up the stairs, shed coat, shoes, and concert dress quickly. My roommates were at a late night party. I had a couple of hours, and then I am not going to subject you to the suicide attempt, but I did want to read that just because I think it expresses the commonality among people who have very different backgrounds. And yet, when you get very, very depressed, your world shrinks. And there is one thing that seems real. And for me, it was my beloved teacher hated me and thought I was a terrible flutist. And now I'm going to drink a sip of water. So, Jody, talk.
Wow. First of all, I'm so sorry that that happened to you, especially by someone you trust. I totally understand that. I spent a lot of my childhood with those events happening. So I'm glad that you were able to manage it the best that you did and, also turn around and be able to share it in a book for the world to see that these kind of things can happen to anyone. Um, and you're right, like the commonalities of, suicidal behaviors or tendencies are all the same. And when you narrow down, it doesn't matter what the trauma is, the depression that comes with it, all depression has like certain symptoms that are, common around the world, not just, in North America. It's a tough thing to struggle with, and
Yes,
I'm proud of you for getting through it.
thank you. And one of your blogs mentioned isolation, and I think actually I think the blog was positive. It was saying the importance of having close friends, and that is so important. The problem is when you get really depressed, you tend to isolate yourself.
Absolutely.
So the second depression occurred years later. Eventually, I left the symphony. I resigned because I knew if I stayed that it would still be difficult. Even though, oddly, once I attempted suicide, I found the strength to carry on. And I was very lucky that some people who sat around me in the woodwind section reached out to me and talked to me and said, "Look, you're not the problem. It's the first flutist that's the problem." So, with their help, I did recover. But
That's
after,
wonderful.
it's funny, I was in it 5 years. The suicide attempt was smack in the middle of the third year. So, it was like a big descent, and then the next 2.5 years, an ascent that gave me the courage to leave. I mean, I knew that the odds of getting another job as good were slim because auditions are for people with nerves of steel. And especially after my teacher's harassment and, the tapes that played in my head of "you're terrible flutist, blah, blah, blah." When I did take, and I only did this 3 times, an audition for another professional orchestra, I would start out fine. You only have 4 or 5 minutes in an audition, but maybe a minute into it, I'd start hearing Warren Little's diatribe, his, denigration of me.
Mhm.
So I decided to get a doctorate in the hopes that I could get a teaching job. And I enrolled in the doctoral program at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Oh, did I mention that I got raped? Interesting how that just sort of fell off the radar. I mean, I mentioned it earlier. That happened the first year after I left Atlanta. So at first I went to Boston to New England Conservatory, and the rape happened there. It was in the 1970s when it was always the woman's fault. So,
Mhm.
yeah, there was no question about trying to, make a police report or whatever.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I got pregnant from it. And that brought on another layer of shame and guilt. I did decide to get an abortion. And I know people's feelings about the issue are absolutely definite on one side or the other. But I have to say, in my case, it allowed me to lead the life I wanted to live. I mean, if I had been saddled with someone who might have looked like this man, a constant reminder of a night of violence, I don't think, I mean, I was fragile enough. I don't think I would have made it. So I am
Mhm. That makes
very,
sense.
I'm very disturbed by the direction this country. I think Canada is not quite so bad, but um,
No, we're a little more open-minded.
yeah, I'm thinking of moving there depending on certain. results in the lunch.
Yeah, I think half of the states is moving here, depending on the election.
It's going to be very crowded up there. Um, Unfortunately, this is pretty incredible. The therapist I got through the counseling center at the university was a very manipulative man. He eventually lost his license for sexually abusing his patients.
Oh
And
my God.
right, without going into detail, I mean, he never raped me and it never got past. I won't go into detail, but there were people who were much worse off than I. But I did, after the second attempt, I somehow I was in the ICU and unconscious for a couple of days. But when I regained consciousness, I found that my depression was gone. And I can't explain it other than the brush with death just, it was like a kaleidoscope, and all of a sudden things focused in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, right after a suicide attempt is an odd time to quit therapy, but I went back and forth in my mind about it and finally trusted my gut. And I'm sure glad I did because, again, both the flute teacher, first flute, and this therapist were gaslighting me. And we use that term casually, but it was prolonged, ongoing brainwashing. In one case,
Mm-hmm.
to convince me I was a terrible flutist, and in the other case, that unless I talked about my fantasies for him, I would get more and more depressed. And that my depression was because I wasn't brave enough to do what was necessary to have successful therapy, which was to talk about him.
Oh
So,
my God. That's horrible. I've had experiences with a therapist who's actually in the process. Hopefully, she's losing her license in the next year or so. She's got enough complaints on her site now.
oh,
And she's been investigated a couple of times, but she was just the same, just horrific, a narcissist, just a manipulative human being that under no circumstances should be, trying to help anybody with anything.
oh my God, a narcissist. That's
Yes, yeah,
um,
you know.
the worst characteristic for a therapist. Wow.
Hmm.
And yes, women can be just as dangerous as men. And
Oh, absolutely.
the thing is, you're vulnerable because you know, you are their patient, you are putting your trust in them. And it's very hard to sort of see what's happening if they're shrewd. Um, it just was, yeah, it was a hard experience.
Yeah, I understand that. I even had a therapy session where my therapist asked me if we could reverse roles and she could complain about her problems to me and I
Ah,
would be the therapist.
oh, you are
I was like, no, no. And then she proceeded to tell me like the most horrific stuff that she's done. And I didn't even know how to make sense of it. I was just like, oh my God, like you can't, in my head, I'm thinking like, you can't do this. Like, this is
yeah,
ridiculous. And why are you telling me things? And then
wow.
after I filed a formal complaint against her, I ran into some other people who had also filed complaints and she had talked so much about me and my case to other people
Oh no.
without mentioning my name, but they were able to find out who I was.
Oh my God. Boy,
Yeah.
how many
So
rules of therapy therapist patient relationship did she break? And just about every one.
just about everyone. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
So yeah, so I'm very discerning when it comes to I haven't actually been back for therapy since hers. She really turned me off of the therapy
uh,
industry.
understandable. Well, I hope you find someone good because I think it does help help us if we can find someone good. And that's
Yeah.
increasingly hard because, at least in this country, the mental health profession is understaffed. And, there are pockets where you have to wait 6, 8 months, even a year to get in with a
Yes.
psychiatrist.
Yes, we have that problem here too. And then the cost here, because it's not mostly, a lot of it's not covered. And if you want like therapy on the, like to private therapy, you're looking at, $100 to $200 an hour.
Uh,
And people
yeah.
don't have
Oh,
that money anymore. People are
no,
barely getting by buying food.
right. Oh, wow. Yeah, it's really awful. I think what I hope will happen is that enough of us who are willing to be peer counselors or just friends or just sounding boards or shoulders to cry on, uh, without having to go through medical school, that we
Yes.
we need to have a community that helps each other.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's sort of
I
what your
started
blog
out,
does.
yes, yes. When I write, it's so funny because if someone gives me like a topic to write about and I'm in like a scientific or logical frame of mind, it comes out more like an article that would go in a magazine. When I
Oh,
write from an emotional frame of mind, it comes out like my blogs, just raw and honest and truthful. And I think because I write in that manner, it doesn't, limit my audience. My
right.
audience is, from 10 to, or from let's say 14 to, 80 kind of thing. So, and because I'm real and very open, I think that it has encouraged other people to, you know, feel that their story is just as important because like everybody that hears their story is going to affect someone whether you realize it or not. There's always a ripple effect when you have a conversation with people.
Yes, absolutely there is. Wow. I've been slow to join the 21st century, and I do not blog, but I can see that that's a wonderful way to reach a lot of people you would never connect with otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I assume there must be other bloggers about this topic, but I think you have such a good point that when you write about emotions, it's very emotional and therefore very accessible, that it just sort of hits you immediately and would engage a reader right away. Certainly did me. So I thank you and just keep that openness and honesty. It's so important.
I think because most of my life I was, a childhood trauma survivor. So I spent a lot of time being told to, shut up and keep secrets and lie about this and that and the other thing. And then in 2016, I kind of had a little bit of a breakdown. And that's when I started writing and I just like let it all out. And it was like such a relief to get like some of these stories out. Some of them are a little bit, graphic, but
Yeah.
I try to keep not too detailed. But um, it was so helpful and cathartic for me to just be able to release all this weight that I'd been carrying.
Oh, yes. Yes. It does help so much. Maybe not quite as good as an excellent therapist, but it's a hell of a lot better than most therapists. And it's
Yes.
creative.
Yeah.
I mean, you're creating something. I think telling your
Yes.
story feels good, even though it's painful to remember. But you're right, it just feels right to get it out there.
Did you feel that way about your book too when you were writing it?
Well, it's kind of interesting. The the idea for the book had 2 sources. One of them was when I was a flute teacher, I always had my students over to my house a couple of times a year. And, I'd tell them stories, not the awful ones, but funny ones about the Atlanta Symphony. And my son, when he
Hmm.
was about 15, said, Mom, you should write those stories down. So I thought, okay, I'll just write the funny stories down. And then when I was in yoga class, which I still practice, I've been with the same teacher about 20 years.
Good for you. That's awesome.
Yeah. It started out with a woman teacher and she became a man, and he is just as good a teacher. But what she always said, and when he says also at the end of the session, is, I am grateful to my teacher. I am grateful to all my teachers. And I remember, it'd be the end of a yoga session when I was supposed to feel really good and something in me would tighten up. And I thought, oh, I am not grateful to my teacher at all. I realized there was so much stuff that I had never really told anyone, and it was all folded in with, I can't stand to listen to myself recordings of my flute playing, and a lot of shame that, oh, well, I only got into the Atlanta Symphony because I had studied with the teacher, and that actually wasn't true. But that was when I knew. It was in yoga class. I thought, wow, I have a lot of anger towards Warren Little. And having written it, now I can fully feel the gratitude because I'm who I am today because of him. I mean, I would never have become a musician if I hadn't studied with a really good, charismatic teacher.
Hmm.
So
Absolutely.
it's like I have the most positive and the most negative feelings about him.
Yeah, it then that makes it even more complex, when you have a relationship with someone who is in essence toxic, but is
Yes.
also providing you with, encouragement and support and things that, you may not be getting from another place. So we tend to seek it from wherever we can get it and hold on to it because, it becomes important to us.
Yes, but I have to say, in contrast to a lot of cases, in my case, the 5 years I was his student, there was no negative side. He was wonderful. There's nothing inappropriate. So it was not mixed. It's sort of on a timeline mixed, but the 5 years
Right.
as a student were great. The 4 of the 5 years as a colleague were terrible.
Wow. That's awful.
Yeah, someone
That's
has said,
awful.
well, really, it's a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. But again, it's not like he flip flopped. He was in one category as a student, it was great. In the other category as a colleague, it was terrible.
I wonder if he felt like some sort of competition from you, like some jealousy or envy because of, how good you were.
Well, a couple of people have suggested that, and it is so hard for me to even consider that because, of course, I think of myself as his student, and he was much better than I was for many, many years. He was a very good flutist. So, one of the members of the woodwind section said something to me which was really weird. She said, I think part of the problem is that he associates you with his wife. And at that time, he was having marital problems. I knew that my lessons in the eighth and ninth grades were at his house, but from then on were at a music store. But I had no idea that it had anything to do with his marriage. Now, his wife was, of course, 20 years older, but she was a petite brunette, which I was. I'm still petite, but I'm no longer brunette. And there was even one weird time when he said to me, I can never get along with you because you have the same birthday as my wife. I mean, that's a weird comment. And
That is
first
a
of all,
very strange comment.
well, and how did he know? I mean, I guess in those 5 years, at some point, I must have come in right before or on or after my birthday. But so maybe there was something there. He never was inappropriate, other than denigrating me and doing things that would make me sound bad, except for one night when we were on tour, and we'd always go to a bar after a concert, and he took the bar stool beside me, And for a while, we sort of carried on a faux authentic conversation. But then he all of a sudden put his arm around me and drew me to him and whispered, "There's one way your troubles could all go away." And, that's the only sexual harassment. And it was only one night. And maybe he was a little bit drunk. I don't know. But of course, I got up and left.
Yeah, that's an awfully awkward comment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think he was saying, if you sleep with me, we'll get along better. And
It's crazy.
I do know that he went out with one of we were then girls, the girls in our high school flute section. I do know that my friend Anne saw him with her, and she was 20 years younger. So, anyway, the perfect storm, marital problems, more stress at work. I remind him of his wife, only a younger version. I don't know how you want to wrap this up. I think I've said about all I have to say, but I would like to go back to any listeners out there who have suffered or are suffering from depression. Please try to find someone who has been depressed. And I would think online would be a possible way, though that's kind of dangerous too. But blogs are good. So, Jody, do you
Yeah,
have any friends that you can call if you're in a suicidal crisis?
I do. I don't like, I have very selected few friends that I've let in really close to me that I can rely on at the drop of a dime. I think my biggest obstacle that I'm still working on is I'm usually the strong one. I'm usually the person that people are reaching out to. So
Ah,
I'm not that great at reaching out, although I'm getting much better. And I have basically like I lived with active suicidal thoughts for the better part of 35 years, and then passive suicidal thoughts for the next 15 years. And now I've just come to the point where it's just not an option. And I think one of the things that's helped me is I grew up being so afraid of everything, of
mm,
people, of actions, of how I behaved. There was always a negative consequence. So for me, it took me
oh,
a long, long time to realize that after three failed suicide attempts, death doesn't want me. It's not my
right.
time. So I decided, you know what, my trauma has to mean something.
Yeah.
So that's when I started writing because I figured if the least that I can do is provide support and unjudgmental comfort and safety for someone else who's on the ledge or who's in the middle of a depressive crisis. So I do spend a lot of time just volunteering as peer support. And I do run a space on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, that has a little community and it's not recorded. It's just a little safe community for people to share about their trauma. And it's,
Oh,
you know,
that
helped a
is.
few people and it's helped me as
Oh,
well.
that is so good that you're doing that. And again, if I had been able to call or view something like that when I was on the brink, it would have made a lot of difference, I think. So
It
thank
really
you. But
does. It really does.
but you sometimes need to be the patient.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm learning to let myself I'm learning to better sit with my feelings and process them. I'm learning that instead of being afraid of everything, to kind of change my perspective to being curious. So
Mm.
instead of being afraid of what's going to happen tomorrow, then I'm more like curious as, oh, what can happen tomorrow? And I will often run like if I'm, for example, I started this podcast years ago, and then when COVID hit, I kind of just stopped doing everything. And it took me, like the last 3 or 4 years to build up enough confidence. And I was like, oh my God, am I going to start my podcast again? What if nobody listens and whatever else? So I ran like the worst case scenario. So the worst thing that can happen is that no one listens and I don't record another podcast. And then I think, well, how does that affect my life? And it really doesn't, right?
That won't happen.
Whereas before, I would have thought, oh my God, I'm going to be a failure. Now I'm just like more willing to take the risk and take the chance. And if it goes good, then I'm happy. And if it doesn't, then that's a learning experience.
That is wonderful. I hope you can hang on to that shift in perspective. And I mean, I'm 78 and I am feeling I was scared to do this interview. I've never done an interview, but I think the older I get, the more important it is to take a risk.
Yes,
And
yes, absolutely.
you know, you don't feel comfortable with it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Exactly. And I think I'm learning to live in that uncomfortable zone a lot better than just retreating and hiding from it. And I'm super proud of you. I mean, this is your first podcast and you came on and you did a fantastic job and, you shared your story and whether you know it or not, your story will resonate with someone out there. And, that could in itself could just change a life just by
Oh,
listening to your story. So everyone's story is so important. And I want to thank you so much for, coming on the show and sharing of yourself and of your book and of your successes and of the traumas that happened to you.
well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I kind of wish you lived a little closer so I could really meet you. But it was a pleasure to talk to you. And now I can say I've done an interview.
Yes, absolutely. And you made a new friend too. You have my phone number, you have my email. If you ever want to just chit chat, you just give me a call. If you want to come back on the show, you can do that.
Okay.
I love to meet new people and I love to make new connections. So
That is very, very generous of you. Thank you. Thank you.
oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for your time and thank you for sharing your story and and writing a book. I mean, it just inspires me that, it can be done. It doesn't matter your age or your
Good.
story. You can get things done and you're living proof of that.
Thank you again.
You're so welcome, my dear. Let's stay in touch
Okay.
and we'll catch up soon. And thank
Okay.
you again for your time. I appreciate it so much.
Good luck with the shortening days. I will think about you.
Yeah, I know. I'll think about you too. It's crazy, right?
Right. Okay.
Okay, dear. We'll talk soon.
Sure. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Mental Health Raw and Open podcast with your host, Jody Betty. If you enjoyed today's show, please give it a like and don't forget to smash that subscribe button. And if you appreciate the work I do, why not buy me a coffee? Details in the show notes. Today's episode was recorded and edited by Dorian Kent and produced by Jody Betty and Dorian Kent. This has been a Raw and Open production.